Welcome back to the Ghosted Podcast. I know this episode is probably coming out way after Thanksgiving, but we are recording the day before Thanksgiving, and at least I know I'm kind of in vacation mode. So this is going to be a fun podcast. I have a special guest here. I mean, obviously every episode is fun, so, this might just be a little extra fun. But at least I have not started, having any Thanksgiving champagne or anything like that. So today we're going to talk about the honeymoon phase, which I'm super excited to discuss. We haven't really touched on it in the podcast. There are lots of phases of dating, and maybe we can kind of talk about some others too. But the honeymoon phase is, as you know, when you're like, ooh, this person's so great. They can do no wrong in your eyes. I mean, I think this could last a month, maybe even 2 years. We're going to dig into this with Lauren Smith. Lauren, thank you for being here.
Hey, Abby, thanks for having me.
Of course. And I want to read your bio so people know why you're here to talk about this. And we have a whole lot of other things, too, that you're an expert on that we want to talk about. So Lauren is an author, speaker, and course creator who helps modern daters in their quest for love, combining her own personal success story with her professional mindfulness training. She empowers singles to ditch the dating struggle and claim the loving relationship they so deeply deserve. Sounds good.
Yay!
So how have things been going? I know this is a crazy time of year for single people. For me, as a matchmaker, do you find the same thing? This kind of like fall, winter time?
Yeah, people refer to it as cuffing season, that time of year where everybody wants to find that person to be able to snuggle up with on the couch through the winter months. And I think it's like, especially coming out of the pandemic, now that everybody's been back out and dating, we've had all of the knowledge from being alone in the solitude of quarantine that maybe it's just me and some of my clients, but I feel like everyone's yearning for deeper, more intimate connections.
I definitely see that too. And I never know if it's like, okay, am I biased just because those are the people that are coming to me? Those are the people who are hiring a matchmaker, which maybe, but I do think people are prioritizing more and more the less casual hookup type of relationship.
Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can definitely have a meaningful short-term relationship. But I think, we're at the time of year where we know we at least want someone to get us through the winter.
And maybe you can even enter into the honeymoon phase with this person. Who knows? So I know I kind of explained, at least from my perspective, what the honeymoon phase is. But, how do you see that playing out with some of the people you work with?
Yeah, it's definitely that time when you're in like an infatuation phase where everything that the other person says and does is kind of perfect. Mm-hmm. And you're subject to some specific neurochemicals that get released in your brain. So when you're in the honeymoon phase, it feels so good and your brain is like shooting off dopamine and noradrenaline and all these other chemicals that when you're with them, it really does feel like the best thing ever.
Right?
Then when
it's
you
like
leave them, it really is. And then when you leave them though, those chemicals crash. That heightened joyful state isn't sustained. So when you're not with them, you're craving them. You're like, oh my God, I need to be around this person. I need my next dose, right? Mm-hmm. And then to make matters worse, dating is scientifically stressful. So we have cortisol that's getting released in addition to all of these feel-good chemicals. So our whole body is just like kind of all over the place. And you can imagine that makes it really difficult to make wise dating choices. So learning how to navigate the honeymoon phase with some mindful awareness can really set you up for dating success. So that way, if you are looking for something long-term, you can come out of the cuffing season and have your partner with you that will hopefully last through spring and summer and hopefully many years.
Right. And all the seasons. I always joke with people, you got to date someone for at least all the seasons before you really decide, because you need to see what they look like in shorts, But also just to give it some time too, of course. And, the honeymoon phase, in my opinion, and I'm curious what you think too, I mean, it could happen really early on. You could meet someone and just be, really into them, wanting to see them all the time, like you were talking about. It could be after a few dates, a handful of dates. It doesn't have to be once you have, defined the relationship necessarily.
Oh, I agree. I feel like in most cases it does happen before you define the relationship. I think it's that phase where you're just like, so let's say you go out on a handful of dates, right? Maybe 20% of the time you find this type of person that you're actually drawn to, like you're legitimately attracted to, and you get even more excited because you're like, great, I finally found someone that might be this dream partner that I've been trying to manifest for myself. And it's like that fantasy just pushes things along faster. Because you're like, oh, this is it. Maybe this is the person. And you start daydreaming about how perfect your life is going to be. And that kind of pushes you farther and farther into that honeymoon daydream state where you kind of lose track of reality. You might lose track of the logical things that you wanted for yourself and a partner. You might lose track of yourself. The honeymoon phase is great. It feels amazing. I'm not knocking it. But you really do have to be able to keep your wits about you. And I do have some tips that we can talk about.
Oh, well, hit us with the tips. I think this is the perfect time.
Good. So when it comes to the honeymoon phase, we're all about emotions and our feelings. We're not really worried about the past, and anything that we are thinking about in the future is really just feelings based. We want to just keep creating a present moment and a future fantasy that feels good to us. Right. So when it comes to making decisions, though, if you make a decision based off of just feelings alone, just emotions alone, like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, you're going to not pay attention to any of the logical things. Right. And you need those logical data points so that you can make sure that your long-term goals align, that you're aligned on very important deal breakers like the way that they handle their money, whether or not they want kids. Like these really big things, sometimes we can forget to address at all because we're like, I don't even care. I just want to go make out with this person in the back of a movie theater. Like you don't even want to ask the questions for fear that you might expose that your dream person is actually a flop.
Right, because you're feeling so good too. You're like, I don't want to get off of this wave. I'm riding high. But you know, it's like, you got to remember, if you're looking for a serious relationship, you want to know those things.
For sure. So what I did was, and I use this with my clients, is I borrowed a evidence-based therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT for any other therapy geeks out there. It's called Wise Mind, and it's essentially balancing two rigid systems. So on the one hand, when we're in the honeymoon phase, we've got a lot of the emotions that are way too powerful. Some people, though, come in hot and heavy with the logic. These are the people that have a dating checklist that they're like, oh, he or she needs to have blue eyes, and they need to have this much money, and they need to like documentaries, and like all of these things that are like, some of them might be important, but the other ones are like maybe not so important. But if you only look at your logical list, you're going to completely ignore the emotions. So the whole point of Wise Mind is to take these two rigid extremes and find the sweet spot where they overlap.
Magic.
And this is where mindfulness comes in. Because if you're not mindfully aware, you can't be, you might not be paying attention to what your feelings are leading you to do. And you might not be aware of how your thoughts are influencing you as well.
It's a really good point, because you can get caught up in one or the other. And personally, you know, through matchmaking, I feel like I do see one of two extremes. And usually it's the more like analytical, logical person who comes to me. You know, maybe it's a guy who has literally like tracked the probability of a date going on to a second date based on her level of attraction from a 1 to 10 and how much money she makes from 1 to 10. And I'm like, oh my God, throw this math out the window. Like there is a point where obviously both ends become too much. So, you know, I'm curious for you, like how someone who is that logical or analytical about dating, how are you then like, okay, let's bring in a little emotion, take it down on the analytical a little bit?
Sure. And I agree with you. I find that the trend is that everybody, I can't say everybody, but most people do have that logical approach to dating, especially when we have these apps that are very much about us weeding things out. Like we're swiping, we're like canceling people out. It's kind of like the emotional aspect of dating has already been stripped out from the beginning. But I do think that once you hit that honeymoon phase, once you say, yes, this is somebody that I might be actually good for, then it's like, then you let the logic go away. And you let the emotions come in. However, I don't really think that that's helpful either. My whole thing is that we need to balance both. So the technique that I use and that I help my clients to learn as well is how to integrate mindfulness into the dating practice. So in quarantine, I got dumped big time. And this is where I learned this lesson for real. So I was like, it was right when the pandemic, like the whole country shut down. And I was home alone and I had just gotten dumped. And
good timing. Jeez.
Well, it was in retrospect because I was able to sit there and be like, okay, Lauren, I hate that this keeps happening to me. Because it's like every time I had gotten dumped, it felt like it was the same situation, the same arguments. Yeah. And like this wound in my heart was just being reopened over and over again. So in the solitude of that month, I was like, I am putting my foot down. I am not letting this happen to me again. I'm going to get to the bottom of what it is that I'm doing. Because I'm obviously the common denominator here. So I did a lot of reflection and I read up on mindfulness, on all these therapies. And I realized that the best way for me to get through it was to journal after every date.
And
for all you logical people, and for all you logical people out there, this really was funny for me because I ended up merging my logic. I made a spreadsheet. And I printed out the spreadsheet. And I made sure that I had all of the important questions on there, like the ones that are going to bring the emotions in. So you guessed it. One of the questions is, what are you feeling? What emotions are coming up for you?
Right.
Just making space to ask yourself that question is so important. Other questions on there are, what did you love about yourself on the date? You know, what insecurities were coming up? Really just sitting with your heart and saying, okay, let me reconnect with why I'm going out on a date. I want to find somebody that's going to love me, that's going to make me feel like I'm seen and heard. And I think a lot of times when we don't reflect, we give that power away to the other person. And we think, oh, well, are they going to call me back? And oh, maybe I did something wrong. And you just kind of wait around for them to text you. So I think that journaling helps you to get back in your place of power and say, okay, where is it that I'm coming from? And what is it that I want?
I love that you suggest people do that because I am 1000% on the same page with you. Whenever I have people go on a date, we set it up. They have a little questionnaire prompt that they fill out for me that is kind of along the same lines, where it's like, hey, how did you present on the date? You know, were there any red flags you were feeling? You know, could you do any better? Are you curious to get to know them more? You know, kind of going through all the things where it's like, okay, yes, logically, if you say yes to these things, you should go on another date. But also acknowledging maybe you were also feeling a conflicting emotion that, you know, might lead you to not want to go on the date. And then having people like us in your lives where you can say, okay, let's talk it through. Let's figure it out. You know, I love it. Thank you for doing that. And I think you have like a journal people can buy, I saw as well, if they want to journal about their dates.
That spreadsheet ended up becoming the Mindful Dating Journal. I co-authored it with a therapist of 20 years, and we curated the questions so that they can help anyone.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, Lauren, you and I have so much in common. I have a therapist who does all kinds of things with me too. You know, every good dating coach needs their therapist buddy who deals with the trauma for you, right?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm glad we're on the same page with all this. And then I want to talk about too, like after the honeymoon phase. Let's say you survived the honeymoon phase. You're like, okay, I, you know, managed all of my crazy hormones going all over the place. And now I'm wondering, do I still like this person without all the hormones? You know, what is that phase that happens next?
I don't know if I know a name for it.
We should come up with a word for it, I think.
I mean,
think of it.
We were talking about like seasons, how you need to date someone for many seasons. I feel like it could be like the spring. I don't know. Like things are starting to blossom and you're starting to see new things grow. And
I feel like it could hopefully be like the stable phase is what I would want to call it. You know, maybe it's like people say it's boring, but stable can be good. Of where maybe you're not like high highs, low lows, honeymoon. You're like, okay, stability.
Yes, I like yours much better than my spring.
It could be spring too, if it aligns with the season.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, the idea of the stable. But I think, too, that the honeymoon phase could be a mindset. You could still cultivate the honeymoon phase type feelings, no matter what phase you are in a relationship. If you stay in the space of appreciation and curiosity, playfulness, and just being really open with how you're feeling. If you're feeling like you're getting bored, let them know. Do something to spice it up.
Right. And I feel like there's a level of boredom that actually is okay in a relationship. I know this might be like a minority opinion, but I'll have couples where they're like, maybe they're used to this roller coaster vibe of a relationship. And I'm like, I want you to go and get in a boring ass relationship that is so stable that you don't even know what to do with yourself. Of course, if it's like that all the time, we're all going to be bored. You got to have some kind of excitement. But I think there should be times where you're like, I'm bored. There's nothing really amazing happening. There's nothing really bad happening. We're just here. We're stable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could even like twist that word around, and instead of seeing it as,
right,
oh, I'm bored,
yes.
You can say, wow, this is so peaceful.
Better.
I feel so peaceful with this person. I recently read somewhere about how toddlers that go to preschool or whatever school they go to, they do this thing called parallel play, where they could be playing and doing something independently in the same room or nearby another child who is playing independently. And that this same technique can be used for adults in relationships as well. It's like, when you say, oh, I really want to find that person where I can just be relaxing and doing nothing with and still feel comfortable around them. That's essentially what we're talking about a little bit when you say you're bored, because I bet you're so comfortable around that person.
Right.
And maybe they're watching football and you're reading a book. That's parallel play. You're both living your own lives right next to each other in the same space, but you feel so safe with them. And you trust that you can do your own thing and not have to worry about them, that your bond is not going to be diminished because you're not one-on-one interacting all the time. And I think that's a gift. So the next time you're bored, just be like, wow, what a gift this is, that I can be doing my own thing and know that my relationship is solid and that I don't always have to be constantly investing in it. I can still take time to be peaceful within myself.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe we call it the peaceful phase. I don't know.
I dig it.
Okay. We'll come up with some phases, as we go. We'll have more fun words for you guys. And another thing I know, Lauren, you mentioned on your Instagram, I saw it on your website, is kind of this toxic relationship cycle that you help people maybe identify that, break out of it. I would think a lot of our listeners have probably been in one of these cycles. And, might benefit from learning a little bit about this. So, how would you define this cycle, this toxic relationship?
Sure. So the term that I use is that it's a dating loop.
Ooh, okay.
We just get so used to dating the same people. We get used to coping with the threat of rejection and the threat of loss that we just keep doing the same things. It's like we're stuck on a behavioral default. So when it comes to dating, we might find somebody that totally turns us on, and we don't realize that there's something about that person that's triggering us. And in a weird way, we're attracted to people that are going to trigger us. Just the way that we were raised, the way that our parents loved us, if there was any holes in that love, we're going to search out that in an adult partner. And if they can't properly fill that hole, it's just going to keep triggering us. It's not their responsibility to fill that hole, by the way. This is
right.
about our own individual healing. And this is why we work with therapists. This is why we journal and get help from matchmakers to make sure that we find somebody that's going to be a good match for us. But the thing is that we don't realize that when we pick these people, they're really triggering our default way of being in a relationship. And if we don't learn to bring awareness to the choices that we're making without thinking, we're never going to see something different. That's why I kept getting broken up with seemingly the same person over and over again, even though it was different people, because I kept choosing the same toxic types. So it's really hard to know what your toxic type is. If we knew it, we would all not be choosing these people, right? So what I did is I worked with a therapist, the one that helped me write the book, and we kind of mapped out a lot of common themes that daters tend to pick. You know, people that are emotionally unavailable tend to pick other emotionally unavailable people. I'm guilty of that. People that are people pleasers and codependents end up finding people that need to be, quote, saved, or that really demand a lot of work from us. So these dynamics of different patterns that come up, these are all called your toxic dating loops. I have a freebie. There's 8 loops. They're all over my Instagram, or you can download them. But the point is that when you can take a look at this list, it's a lot easier to say, oh shit, that's me. You might not have been able to see it in your head before, right? Because we just don't know. But when you read the list, that's when you can say, oh, I think I see what I'm doing here. And when you can tack the awareness on it, the next time that loop comes up, you're going to be able to say, hey, Lauren, I see what you're doing here. You're trying to people please. You're trying to save them, whatever it is. And then you can choose something other than your default response, something that's going to be more healing for you. You can communicate, set boundaries, whatever it is that you need to do.
And was there a moment for you when you had this aha moment of like, oh, that's my toxic dating loop?
Oh, yeah. So the girl that broke up with me at the beginning of COVID, I call her Mila. Mila had her own fair share of traumas and problems in this world. And I was very eager to solve all of her problems for her. I worked really hard, and I ended up like slowly and getting farther and farther away from myself. I even started like missing work calls. I was drinking on weeknights, like things that were really not my typical personality. And I was going down a path with her that I couldn't really get off of because I had made so many unconscious choices just because I wanted to keep her. I wanted to keep us, that I really betrayed a lot of what I had previously wanted for myself, my career, my life. And when she broke up with me, I was able to finally say, whoa, how did I get here? I'm so off course. And I was able to kind of like reverse domino effect by looking at where I was there. Like, you don't have that perspective when you're caught up in the storm. But when the storm is over, you can look back on it and be like, all right, I can clearly see how I got here. And it just so happened that with Mila, this was the most dramatic breakup that I had ever had. So it was really easy to compare it with all of the other ones, because I was like, she's just making it so clear for me what these patterns are. So I realized that I was waiting around for Mila to make changes in her life based on all of the sacrifices that I was making. And if anybody out there is a people pleaser, I think you can sympathize as well. But I don't know what's good for her. And she wasn't ready to make changes in her life. And it just was contributing to a lot of resentment in me. I just got angrier and angrier. And at the end of the day, I realized that I felt like I was angry at Mila because she wasn't, quote, taking responsibility. But I was the one that wasn't taking responsibility. I wasn't taking responsibility for my time, how I was spending my time, the choices that I was making. I wasn't talking about things that were bothering me. And I was kind of just digging myself into the hole. So I guess the moral of the story is that I was able to see that it wasn't that I can put everything on the toxic partner. Like when I say a toxic dating loop, this takes 2 people. It's not about choosing the right or wrong person for you. It's about showing up for that relationship with yourself from a healed place. And I realized that I was not doing that. I was the toxic poison in that relationship. I also now do not choose people like Mila. I choose different people that are more in alignment with what I really need and want. But it all started with me really sitting back and saying, what is it that I'm doing? And that's really hard because you have to like be a little harsh with yourself. You have to admit that you're not perfect. No one is.
And it's so much easier to blame the people around us or the people that we're dating. You know, it takes a lot to be like, oh, wait, this is something I'm doing. And like you said, obviously it takes 2 people to make something toxic. But, it's like if you are then saying, okay, I'm getting into the same, not so great relationship every single time, it's not just like, oh, it's those people, like everyone else sucks. It's time to say, time out. Let's look at me and see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's tough. Hand in hand with mindfulness, I've been learning self-love. Because without giving me that kindness and that safe space for me to admit that it was me all along that was really keeping myself stuck, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I would have kept pushing it away.
Right. And I think a lot of the times too, people who are in that space might reach out to a you or a me or anyone else in our field and say, oh, if I have an expert, then this will all be fixed. And, both of us, I'm sure, wish we could just say, hey, snap our fingers and everything's great and fixed, but you're still going to have to do the work on yourself, unfortunately.
Yes, that's very true. And it really also matters, like, getting down to the root of what it is you're looking for in a relationship. Mm-hmm. Remember earlier I was talking to how, like, a lot of clients will go out on a date and they'll come back and they'll be like, well, I don't know what he thought about me. And she didn't text me back. And like, what if they don't like me? That's, you're not in alignment with what you want, if that's what you're thinking about. And if you go into a matchmaking situation and you really aren't clear on the kind of life that you want to create, on your values, on your purpose in this life, you might just settle for anyone that's giving you attention. Mm-hmm. Because you really just want to be accepted and you want to be validated by someone else, which is great. That's an amazing part of a relationship. Mm-hmm. But when you can learn to accept and validate yourself first, you're probably not going to settle. You're going to be like, nope, this isn't in alignment with what I want. I'm on to the next.
Right. Or after the date, you're like, hey, that was great. I enjoyed meeting that person, and just saying how you feel rather than be like, oh, what about them? Were they into it? Mm-hmm. Did you hear anything? That's a really, I think, interesting perspective too, because it's like, hey, know how you feel. And, if you work with me, then I'll tell you how the other person feels, so you aren't left hanging. And make sure if you're not working with me, you communicate that with the person you're on the date with. Do not leave them hanging and do not ghost them. Hence the name of this podcast.
Yes.
So yeah, if you listen to this podcast, you obviously know what we're all about. And Lauren, I wanted to make sure we give a little bit of time for you to kind of explain exactly how you work with people, and then how they can reach out to you as well.
Oh, thanks, Abby.
Of course.
Well, I just got done a live group course on self-love for singles, so stay tuned for when that will launch again in the future. Right now, I'm just here trying to spread the word of the mindful dating system that I made, trying to help people see that they don't have to keep suffering. It's really my purpose is I just want to help people not have to go through all the bad breakups that I went through. Mm-hmm. So I'm really just trying to build a community at this point. Check me out on Instagram, send me a DM, let's be friends.
Awesome. And where can they find you on Instagram?
At Metadate, METTA.
Awesome. And tell me, I feel like there's got to be a story behind that name.
Yeah, there is. So metta is a form of Buddhist meditation of loving kindness. Mm-hmm. So it's the idea that we're going to date with loving kindness to ourselves and to others.
Awesome. I love it. And I always like to end these podcasts with a little words of wisdom. I know we've had that throughout the entire episode, but is there any other advice you would like to impart to our single listeners?
I would say that it's not selfish to love yourself while dating.
It's so true. It is not selfish. Love yourself. Practice it, especially during the holidays. I know this episode will be out at least before, Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year's, whatever you're celebrating. And there could be all kinds of pressure to do all kinds of things. So love yourself first. That's great.
Yes. Thanks, Abby.
Thank you, Lauren. It was great having you on the podcast, and hopefully we can have you back sometime soon.
Sounds great.
Awesome.